20. The Shah's Last Ride. And my large kingdom for a little grave, a little grave, an obscure grave. Shakespeare, King Richard II, 3.3, verses 154 to 155. On the cold, slushy morning of January 16th, 1979, Tehran awoke to a day of anxious anticipation. The city was once again awash with rumors. For years, rumor had become the tool of subversion. Censorship is not just the mother of metaphors, as George Louis Borges suggests, but also begets rumors, a veritable tool in any opposition's arsenal in authoritarian regimes. That day, the winds of change lurked in the air. For too long, the country had been suspended in the paralysis of a political stalemate. Neither the regime nor the opposition had the power to end the crisis. For a variety of reasons, a compromise was unreachable. Something had to give. Historians tell us that a prolonged period of paralysis between conflicting forces usually gives rise to a Caesar, to a kind of Bonapartism. But in Iran, everyone expected the Shah to blink. A week earlier, right after the Guadalupe meetings, U.S. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance had announced that the Shah has said that he plans to leave Iran on vacation. The announcement reflected the conclusions the British and American governments had reached about the Shah by early November 1978. The Guadalupe Conference of the top four Western powers in early January had only confirmed this decision, with both governments insisting that they would not support a military crackdown, with the opposition becoming more radical with every passing day. The Shah was politically dead. In the past, too, the Shah had often blinked in times of crisis, yet had somehow survived. But this time, his adversary, Ayatollah Khomeini, was a man of steely determination. He had emerged as the de facto leader of the amorphous democratic movement only by virtue of his unbending resolve and untarnished reputation, and he was keen to use any weakness in the Shah to overthrow the monarchy. 2 days after the announcement of the Shah's intention to go on vacation, Khomeini announced the formation of an Islamic Revolutionary Council, and as a harbinger of things to come, the composition of the council was, and remained, a secret. 11 days after the beginning of the royal family's vacation, Ayatollah Khomeini sent a personal message to U.S. that cleverly combines threats with promises of peaceful transition. He recommended that in order to avert disaster, the U.S. advised the army and Bakhtiar to stop intervening in Iranian political affairs. He concluded his message by asserting his preference for solving the problem peacefully. For several weeks before this message, he and his entourage in Paris and his allies in Tehran had been in touch with the American embassy. The Iranian people not only knew nothing about Khomeini's letter or about other extensive contacts between him and American officials in Paris or Tehran, they were also generally ignorant of Ayatollah Khomeini's real intentions. His 14 years of exile had afforded him the unique luxury of having no track record of compromising with the regime. A sincere, tarnished one, potential nationalist leader, a few lucrative contracts comprised the integrity of another. Yet a third lost his gravitas when he was shown in a photograph prostrating himself before the king and queen. Khomeini had lived in the relative safety of Najaf during the years when the Iraqi government, particularly under Saddam Hussein, was a fierce foe of Iran. There, Ayatollah Khomeini had issued one proclamation after another, attacking the Shah in increasingly virulent language. In the 1960s and 1970s, these radical pronouncements were often seen as the quixotic rants of an embittered, exiled foe of the regime. In 1978, however, he modulated his words about the intentions, but remained steadfast in his uncompromising opposition to the Shah. Of those who knew what those plans were, who knew the true mettle of Ayatollah Khomeini, some of the Ayatollah Shariat Madari were unwilling to fight him publicly. They saw him as a modern-day Savonarola, whose piety was but a veneer for power lust, and who was dedicated to the idea of forcing the establishment of a new Puritan Shiite society, with Khomeini as the absolute arbiter of truth. In the days before the revolution, these forces mostly chose silence. In the handful of cases in which they dared to speak, as Shapur Bakhtiar did during his brief tenure as Prime Minister, their warnings were altogether most the cacophony of hysterical adulation for the coming revolution. Others, like Mehdi Berogan, kept silent in return for a place at the table of power. Like everyone else in the opposition, Bazargan believed he would temper Ayatollah Khomeini's radicalism. Even the fact that in 1963 Khomeini had rallied against women's rights to vote and against land reform was conveniently forgotten. Selective public amnesia, prodded by a masterful public relations campaign, including the audacious claim that his profile had appeared on the moon, made him an ambiguous symbol, a tabula rasa, allowing each element of the radical desperate coalition against the Shah to see him not for what he was, but for what he dreamt he would be. For some, a pious reincarnation of Mossadegh. For others, a Kerensky who would pave the way for their planned Bolshevik revolution. Iranian society and the American embassy in Iran were not alone in this dangerous game of wishful self-delusion. Prominent Western intellectuals, such as Michael Foucault, saw Khomeini as a breath of fresh air after a century of intellectual regurgitation of the Enlightenment's sterile ideas. Not only was this an instance of Foucault's remarkable arrogance in making historic judgments about a society and religion he knew virtually nothing about, it also reflected the progressive Western intellectual's romantic weakness for any radical force that was anti-American or anti-Western. In the absence of reasoned debate about Khomeini and his ideas, his Paris proclamations, all carefully crafted to fit the movement, became most people's only introduction to the man. Exercising remarkable discipline in Paris, he held the pose of a liberal on that January 16th. This political discipline was about to bear fruit. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Iran, all ears turned to the radio. For the generation of Iranians, the 2 o'clock news had the regularity of the seasons. It was the anointed time for the news. In the Shah's days of power, The lead every day was invariably his deeds and words. After that came an account of the Queen's daily activities. Only then came the real news of the day, when Reza Qutb, the Queen's closest confidant and relative, was appointed as the head of Iran National Radio and Television. One of his early innovations was to change the lineup of the news, allowing each day's real story to lead. Before long, he was forced to reconsider, and the old anointed lineup was revived. One of the first signs that the Shah's power had genuinely declined came late in 1978, when he was no longer the lead on every day's news. But on that January day, the Shah was not by fiat, but by desert, the lead of the day. At the court, all that day, indeed all that week, life had taken on frantic pace and a transient look. Furniture was covered with sheets, paintings were taken off the walls, boxes lay about. By January 14th, 5 crates, enough to fill the second jet that was to accompany the Shah's official plane, had been packed with valuables and the personal belongings of the Shah and his family. Earlier, a small charter jet had taken Eliazi, one of the Shah's most trusted valets, to Geneva, where he reportedly deposited in banks the most valuable papers of the Shah. The charter flight was kept a strict secret. What the valet took is not known. Every day rumors of these and other transactions, like the alleged transfer of almost $2 billion by leading officials of the ancient regime, whose names, along with the amounts of their individual transfers, were published by a group claiming to be employees of the Central Bank of Iran, swept the city, disheartening the Shah's supporters and cementing the resolve of the opposition. The Shah had been growing increasingly short-tempered and overtly anxious to leave Iran. What went through his mind we may never fully learn. What we do know is that he felt betrayed, not just by his people, but by his allies in the West. He felt he had been misled by sycophants for years, and that the people seemed to have rejected everything he had done for them. In reality, 25 years of sycophancy in courtiers, his decided aversion to hearing the bitter truth, and his oft-repeated claim that he received reports from multiple sources had resulted in his near paralysis when faced with the reality of massive opposition to his rule. The unbreakable bond the Shah had always believed connected him to the people was torn asunder in his mind, and the sobering reality of the people's anger could no longer be ignored. For at least 16 years, the Shah had moved closer to becoming the ultimate source for nearly all key decisions in the country. In 1965, the State Department had put together a list of the decisions that could only be made by him. The Shah, the reporter said, is not only king, he is de facto prime minister and is in operational command of the armed forces. He determines or approves all important governmental actions. No appointment to an important position in the bureaucracy is made without his approval. He personally directs the work of the internal security apparatus and controls the conduct of foreign affairs, including diplomatic assignments. No promotion in the armed forces from the rank of lieutenant up can be made without his explicit approval. Economic development proposals, whether to accept foreign credit or where to locate a particular factory, are referred to the Shah for decision. He determines how the universities are administered, who is to be prosecuted for corruption, the selection of parliamentary deputies, the degree to which opposition will be permitted, and what bill will pass the parliament. This incredible concentration of power was in place even before the 1970s, when the Shah's personal authoritarianism and its accompanying cult of personality reached a new height. Amir Abbas Haveda has been rightly criticized for facilitating, indeed encouraging, this royal power grab. Now the Shah, the nerve center for all decisions, was beset with depression, indecision, and paralysis, and his indecision led to the immobilization of the entire system. Paralyzed by a potent combination of qualities in his character, the medications he had been taking, and the unexpected turns in his fortune, his mood grew increasingly volatile and unpredictable. One day he was full of verve and optimism. The next day or hour he fell into a catatonic stupor. Because of his regular meetings with the American and British ambassadors, we can map out his mood swings. One day he was reluctant to meet with anyone, and if he gave an audience, he made it clear that he had little time or interest. The next day he spent hours in meetings where he paid close attention to the advice offered by those he met. Hardly a day passed without some new suggestion by one of his loyal generals or one of the newly minted self-appointed royal advisers. Some saw terror and brute force as the remedy, while others saw concessions to the opposition as the solution. One group of generals offered a plan to use their air force and bomb the throngs of demonstrators in the cities of Qom and Tehran. There was the idea that the Shah should usurp the leadership of the revolution by hanging a few of his own supporters from the poles of electricity lines in city squares. As ludicrous as it might seem, the Shah, by arresting some of his most dedicated allies and generals, made a half-hearted attempt at this very idea. Finally, there were those who saw pity as a panacea, suggesting that the Shah should talk openly about his sickness and appeal to the Iranian people's sense of decency. They would never throw out of the country a man dying of cancer, Zahedi said. The Queen had several solutions of her own. Her plans were rooted in her desire to save the dynasty and protect her son's chance at the throne. As the Shah's mood and health deteriorated, not only did he become increasingly dependent upon her presence and support, but more and more she and her coterie of advisers and friends took an active, if not determining, role in running the affairs of state. Eventually, she told the Shah that he should leave, as he seemed to be the focus of people's wrath, and allow her to stay as a symbol of your presence. The Shah did not accept the offer, saying sardonically, "You don't have to be a Joan of Arc." Hers was, of course, not the only idea the Shah did not accept. He rejected virtually all other suggestions as either infantile or incongruent with the real complexities of the world. The Shah tended to take false comfort in conspiracy theories, featuring an impotent, enfeebled we and an omnipotent other. Conspiracy theories had become the bane of Iranian politics in the 19th century, just at the time when opium also became the new rage. Both helped soothe souls humiliated by a sense of historic defeat at the hands of the Russians, the West, fate, and all the conspirators. The sort of power that conspirators are purported to have is nothing less than a secularized version of the omnipotence of a Messiah or Mahdi. A people who have lost faith in their messiahs but have yet to reach genuine social mastery of their fate need conspiracy theories to assuage their anxieties and satisfy their existential human urge to have a narrative explanation, a history of their lives and what has befallen them. The Shah suffered from all the social sources of this malady, but his own experience, what he had witnessed during the humiliation of his father at the hands of the British in 1941, and finally his own private demons, exasperated the effects of this national proclivity. During his last months in power, every major decision he made was arguably the worst possible choice. A partial explanation of his devastatingly wrong decisions was his flawed, conspiracy-laden analysis of the situation. In his attempts to address the purported international sources of the revolution, he consistently failed to address the real domestic sources of discontent. Often, the world made sense to him only in terms of a conspiracy. That was why his mood was in no small measure dependent on what he perceived to be the current level of support from the United States and Britain. A few days after Black Friday, September 7th, 1978, when the army had opened fire on demonstrators defying a curfew, he was in a meeting with a group of visitors from Europe. In the middle of the meeting, an aide informed him that President Carter wanted to talk with him on the phone. He left the group and went upstairs to a room where he could talk in private. The conversation lasted 10 minutes, said the chief of protocol, Aslan Afshar, and the Shah was brimming with laughter when he came out of the room. He spryly jumped down the stairs 2 at a time and told me immediately, send a telegram to Carter, write it in a warm tone, and thank him for the call. The sheer fact that Carter had called was for the Shah a sign of support and enough to improve his sagging morale. In retrospect, it is a remarkable fact that while Tehran was burning and Iran moved ever closer to the precipice of chaos, Carter was preoccupied with Camp David and with convincing his guests, Begin and Sadat, to sign a peace agreement. To his credit, Sadat knew the importance of the situation in Iran, and while at Camp David, at least once convinced Carter to call the Shah and offer words of support. While the Shah sought advice from both British and American governments, in reality he trusted neither. In late September 1978, during a meeting with Anthony Parsons, the British ambassador, he let it be known that he was obviously worried that the Americans are plotting with the opposition. More than once he articulated the same sentiment about the British to American and Iranian officials. Distrust of the Soviets was, of course, a constant pillar of his vision. Ultimately, when he felt that his attempts at reconciliation with his omnipotent foreign foes or allies had failed, he became despondent and anxious and unable to rule. Documents from the British and American archives show that the main reason these countries began to search for an alternative to the Shah, and the reason they were so keen on getting him expeditiously out of the country, was their conclusion that he no he was no longer able or willing to lead. Until October 1978, it had been the policy of both governments to try to preserve the monarchy. At the same time, in this period, the two governments also repeatedly talked of the need to limit the Shah's power. All too often, the Shah showed signs of complacency, brooding depression, when in December of 1978, the Comte de Marenches, the head of the French secret police and an old friend of the Shah, arrived in Tehran to discuss with him whether the French government should renew Ayatollah Khomeini's visa. He came away convinced that the Shah's days were numbered. The Shah met the Comte in a dark room, wearing a pair of dark, large glasses. The Shah told the Comte that he preferred that the French government keep Ayatollah Khomeini in Paris. Otherwise, the Shah said, he would end up somewhere like Syria, closer to Iran. When the Comte de Marenches went back to Paris, he told French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, c'est Louis the 16th. The president responded. Is that his name? Could you imagine having to say? Anyway. Alors c'est la fin. Less than 4 years earlier, a New York Times journalist had compared the Shah to the Sun King Louis the 16th. Now he was being compared to the Louis who held... Oh, I see. Okay. Let's read that again, shall we? Otherwise, the Shah said, he would end up somewhere like Syria, closer to Iran. When the Comte de Marenches went back to Paris, he told French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, c'est Louis the 16th. The president responded, alors c'est la fin. Less than 4 years earlier, a New York Times journalist had compared the Shah to the Sun King, Louis the 16th. Now he was being compared to Louis, who helped bring about the French Revolution. Of those entrusted with the task of assessing the Shah's chances of survival, none was more important than George Ball, head of Carter's Iran Task Force. In early December 1978, he suggested that the United States should discreetly open a In early December 1978, he suggested that the United States should discreetly open a disavowable, D-I-S-A-W-O-A-B-L-E, channel of communication with Khomeini, and concluded in no uncertain terms that the days of the Shah as a potentate had ended, and that he could at best retain the throne as a figurehead. Iranians want, Ball concluded, a government responsive to the people. Somehow, though, the Shah never met with Ball. He knew through his contacts with Ambassador William Sullivan that the American government had for some time wanted him to leave the country. More than once, while in exile, the Shah complained about Sullivan's impolitic hurry to force him out of Iran. When Sullivan restlessly looked at his watch, the Shah understood it to mean that the hour for him to leave the country had arrived. Carter's White House diary confirmed Sullivan's insistence that any solution to the problem in Iran would depend on the Shah's speedy departure from the country. On the morning of January 16th, the Shah met with only a handful of servants and valets. Of all who had been given a chance to accompany him on the new trip, few accepted the offer, in spite of the official pretense that he was leaving on a holiday for recuperation. Everyone at the court, and arguably most people in the country, knew that this was a flying. knew that this was a one-way trip. In the past, accompanying the Shah on a royal jaunt was a privilege, coveted by all in the court. This time, those who went knew they courted the danger of permanent exile. The Shah took a helicopter from the palace to the airport. Another helicopter took members of the entourage. As he sank into his seat, he pushed his grief-stricken face against the window and gazed at the city below, as if he wanted to capture for his mind every image. At the airport, the Shah, never attentive of protocol, paid careful attention to all who had taken the trouble to come for the official farewell ceremonies. At the same time, he was impatient, anxious to leave. He was agitated when he saw the gathered reporters. Who asked them to come? He asked his aides impatiently. As with much else that happened at the court those days, nobody knew. It was a tragic exercise in futility, a game where both sides knew the truth behind the public facade. Nonetheless, he told the gathered reporters that he was tired, that he was going away for a vacation and would return as soon as he had recovered. But the grimace on his pained face, the tears in his eyes, the vacuity of his gaze, ever wandering in the empty yonder, and his inability to look any of his well-wishers in the eye, all belied the official pretense of a healing holiday. One of the officers fell at the Shah's feet and asked for permission to save the throne with his life. The Shah, still looking beyond the man's anguished face, raised him to his feet, allowing him to kiss the proffered hand, and then moved past him. The Queen looked on, a fur hat on her head, anguish and compassion for her husband in her eyes. The picture capturing her look and his countenance became iconic of the moment. General Garbaghi, by then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, by law and custom normally entrusted with running the army in the Shah's absence, had been nervously trying to get the Shah to sign the normal constitutional decree that temporarily transferred to the general the powers of the commander-in-chief. In the past, such decrees had routinely been signed the night before the Shah's departure and sent to the general in charge. This time, no decree had come the night before, and even at the airport the Shah seemed reluctant to sign the document. Eventually, after several beseeching looks and requests, the Shah finally beckoned to the nervous general, motioned to him to turn around and bend over, and on his half-bowed shoulders haltingly went through the motions of signing the decree. When the general asked whether the Shah had any last-minute orders, he dismissed the question with a shrug of his shoulders, and in a barely audible voice said, "Do what you think is right. I have nothing to say." Perhaps the Shah knew that the day before, on the afternoon of January 15, 1979, Gharibaghi had agreed to meet with opposition leaders Ayatollah Mohammad Beheshti and Mehdi Bazargan. He must have known that since late December, General Gast, the MAAG chief in Tehran, and Heuser had been working behind the scenes to facilitate meetings between military commanders and Khomeini allies. He must have heard that General Reza Moghadam, the last head of SAVAK, traditionally the most reliable pillar of support for the monarchy, had taken out of the American hands the business of bringing the armed forces and Khomeini supporters to an amicable truce. Moghadam was one of the many generals and allies of the Shah who were trying to arrive at a private pact with the Khomeini forces. And finally the Shah knew that Gorbagi had been a protege of General Fardust, the childhood friend who now stood accused of complicity with the Shah's enemies. In the Shah's famous interview with David Frost in January 1980, when he was asked about the allegation that Gorbagi and Hussein Fardust had betrayed him and had been secretly working with the clerics long before his fall, he responded that their fate was a tragedy only Homer and Shakespeare could describe. He added that in his inner heart he hoped that the stories of conspiracies hatched by the two generals were untrue. They would be so vile, so disquieting, if they were true. Of the two, only Gorbagi was at the airport. By then, Fardust spent his afternoons in a private club playing cards with the dwindling number of patrons who still frequented the once bustling place of power and status. The Shah arrived at the royal pavilion at the airport before Bakhtiar, the prime minister designate, who was at the Majlis, waiting for a vote of confidence. For Bakhtiar, these constitutional formalities were the foundation for his fragile claim to legitimacy. To everyone else, they seemed like rearranging deck chairs on the sinking Titanic. The Shah, anxious to leave, asked his aides to call Bakhtiar and find out what had delayed his arrival. But striking employees had disconnected the phones at the royal pavilion. Eventually, the army's wireless connection was used, and to the Shah's relief, it was learned that the newly confirmed prime minister was on his way. Although Bakhtiar had fought against the Shah for more than 3 decades. When he finally arrived, the sad solemnity of the moment, or perhaps the bereft countenance of the Shah, brought tears to Bakhtiar's eyes. The Shah shook his head and said, "I hope you will succeed. I give Iran into your care, yours and God's." Bakhtiar and General Badre, the commander of the Imperial Guards, followed the Queen and the Shah onto the plane. Neither man would survive the eventual terror of the impending revolution. Inside the plane, both men displayed due deference to the king, bade him a formal farewell, and left. The Shah, teary-eyed, went to the cockpit and piloted the plane during takeoff, and for the first hour of the flight. According to the chief of his security detail, the Shah's decision to pilot the plane that day was not based solely on his passion for flying. He was worried they might conspire to take him somewhere other than the planned destination. As it turned out, this time the Shah's fears were well-founded. Within weeks, the flight's chief pilot, Captain Moezi, revealed that he had joined the opposition before this last trip. Initial plans had called for the Shah to go to the United States, but a few days before departure, he received a call from President Carter asking him to stop over in Egypt to consult with President Sadat and President Ford on the Camp David Accords, and then head for the United States. Visas for him and his entourage, he was told, would be awaiting them in Egypt. In the meantime, in the United States, the State Department had asked Walter Annenberg, the former ambassador to Great Britain, to receive the Shah and a party of up to 15 and put them up for the first week of February at his estate in Palm Springs. The contingency plan called for the Shah to move later to another safe location, possibly with Rockefellers. After his decision to leave the country had been made, the Shah told Aslan Ashfar to call President Sadat's office and find out what the best time would be for the royal plane to arrive in Egypt. He was informed, much to his dismay, that phone connections to Egypt had also been cut by striking employees. The American embassy in Tehran allowed the use of its special lines to contact Sadat's office. It was agreed that the Shah would leave Tehran on the afternoon of January 16th. Unbeknownst to the Shah, a number of other countries had also been contracted about offering him a visa or asylum, and virtually all had said no. Sometimes the countries offered political reasons for their refusal, and other times their answers had the crass reality of mercantilist truth. Germany, for example, replied that they could not offer the Shah asylum or support by reason of the large German investment in Iran and the 13,000 Germans who were working there on the eve of the revolution. At that point, Egypt and America were the only two countries willing to offer the royal family a place to stay. No sooner had the Shah's plane left Tehran than Kayhan, Tehran's most popular daily at the time, ensued a special edition with the entire top fold of the paper covered with two words: Shah left. Ironically, it was the Shah's seed money that had launched Kayhan 36 years earlier. He had wanted a pro-monarchy publication, but by 1979 the paper's de facto editor was Rahman Hatafi, one of the top leaders of the underground Tudeh party in Iran. Under the leadership, the paper had on its staff a whole array of writers and journalists opposed to the regime who used every opportunity to promote their ideas and ideology. The news of the Shah's departure rapidly spread throughout the capital. There was an air of gaiety and celebration in the air. Not just in Tehran, but in many provincial capitals, there were mass demonstrators celebrating the Shah's departure. In a surprisingly well-managed, spontaneous outpouring of exuberance, throngs of people took to the streets, and there were celebrations well into the night. The air of revelry began to taper off early the next morning in overcast Tehran. While the city was brimming with anxious excitement, doors to the expansive U.S. Embassy compound were locked, with no sign of the American flag anywhere. The embassy reported a few threats to foreigners, but everywhere American citizens were spared any threat of actual attack. Revolutions invariably have an element of the carnival about them. They are a country's moment of cathartic celebration. In their early hours of jubilant celebration, fears, constraints, and the Apollonian logic of the quotidian give place to the spirit of Dionysian excess, of make-believe, egalitarianism, of shared community and suspension of rancorous rifts. That day, Tehran experienced its revolutionary carnival. As people danced in the streets, cars drove round aimlessly, with many of their inhabitants braving the cold and hanging out of the cars like human flags. The police and the military seemed to have suddenly melted into the air. Self-declared lords of misrule distributed free candy to passing cars and demanded that drivers turn on their lights and blow their horns. The normal sounds of the city's hustle and bustle were drowned in the collective blaring of car horns. Bands of bearded vigilantes, which had gradually become a constant staple of every large gathering in Tehran, watched in quiet disapproval. Within a year, their mores would become the law of the land. and they would exact a heavy price on the population for their moments of heathenish joy. It took only days to realize that beneath the veneer of the spontaneous but orderly popular demonstrations there was an embryonic force that soon came to be called the Committee. Local militia, cum gangs, cum revolutionaries, based on in local mosques, led by the clergy of those mosques, increasingly armed and increasingly ideological. As the royal army and police melted away, these committees took over their functions. There was, in contrast, little joy aboard Shabazz, the Boeing that had been designed as the royal plane. After piloting the plane for over an hour, the Shah quickly moved past the dozen seats for guards and guests and headed for the royal compartment. It consisted of a sitting area, a conference table, a bedroom, and a bathroom. Dr. Lucy Pernia, a friend of the Queen, Kiomars, Jahambini, and Jazden Navizi, respectively the Shah's and the Queen's bodyguards, Aslan Afshar, the de facto chief of protocol for the Shah, Mahmoud Eliazi, special valet for the Shah, Ali Kaberi, for many years the chief of the court, and finally the man responsible for minding the royal dogs, Beno, the Shah's big German shepherd, and Katsu, the Queen's puppy, were aside from the crew the only people on the plane. Egypt was their destination. By then the Shah was hungry and asked for something to eat, but the airport's catering department had refused to supply the royal plane with food. Let them make their own sandwiches, the catering director had derisively declared. Moreover, the crystal glasses and the chinaware usually used on the plane had all been pilfered. As it happened, Kabiri, perhaps in anticipation of problems at the airport, had prepared some food. Some passengers remember a pot full of rice and a gamey, one of Shah's favorite dishes, while others remember bagali, palau rice, and fawa beans. Using makeshift plates and utensils, the Shah and the rest of the passengers were finally fed. A somber silence was in the air, and there was little appetite among the entourage. After about an hour, Jahanbini was called to the back of the plane where the Shah and the Queen had settled. As he walked through the door, he saw the Shah, his right hand cushioning his reclining head, lying down on the couch. He had taken off his jacket and tie. His red, slightly inflamed eyes betrayed the long, anguished hours he had spent awake. Without moving his head, the Shah raised his eyes and asked, "What do you people think of our decision to leave?" By then, Jahanbini had been serving the Shah for almost a quarter of a century, and by his own admission, this was the first time His Majesty was asking my views on something. At the same time, Jahanbini had noticed the Shah's gradual decline into a state where he distrusted everyone. He had been surprised to learn, for example, that the Shah had ordered the generals in charge of the Air Force base in Tehran to henceforth heed only orders coming through Eliazi, the Shah's valet, about who could leave Iran. In other words, the Shah distrusted not only the civilians serving him in the court, but many in the military hierarchy. In the past, he had been obsessive about maintaining ranks in the military and keeping them strictly walled off from any civilian contact. Now he was asking generals to take orders from a valet. With every passing day, long-established hierarchies and habits had begun to collapse, and in the chaos that ensued, forces of change were found more and more room to maneuver. With this context in mind, Giovanni assumed that the Shah's question was part of an attempt to see whether the members of the royal entourage were dependable. He responded quickly and categorically, "Your Majesty, I and your other servants have total belief in the wisdom of your Majesty's every decision. Everyone is completely convinced of the wisdom of your decision to leave." Remembering the conversation a quarter of a century later, Giovanni added wistfully, "And I was not lying. We all thought the Shah had something up his sleeve." Here again, the August 1953 events would haunt the Shah and his supporters. As the Americans had helped bring the Shah back to power then, they must have a similar plan this time too. The Royalists assumed the Americans were not going to leave the fate of Iran in the untested hands of mullahs, or worse yet, in the hands of communists. What they did not know was that by then, Ambassador Sullivan had concluded that doing another August 1953 was not in the interest of the United States. Some of the generals who remained loyal to the Shah were obviously worried about the future of the country run by Khomeini, while others might well have been banking on another August 1953, when those who remained loyal to the Shah had been amply rewarded when he was restored to power. One of the generals who paid a heavy price for such loyalty to the Shah in 1979 was Ali Neshat. Before leaving Iran, the Shah had entrusted General Neshat with a sensitive mission. By then, all the documents in the Shah's office at the court, Daftar-e-Maksus, or special office, had been removed to a basement in the Syed Abad Palace. The most sensitive documents had neither been sent out separately with Eliazi on the chartered plane, or went with the Shah when he left Iran. More than once in his daily journals, Asadullah Alam cryptically refers to documents so sensitive that he dared not even mention their topic. They were kept in a safe in the Shah's office. What happened to those documents and what they contained remains unknown. They could have been part of what Eliazi took to Switzerland, but there were also thousands of pages of documents dealing with the affairs of the state or of the royal family. They were all placed in the basement of the palace before the Shah left. General Neshat, commander of the Imperial Guard, was entrusted with the task of burning them the moment the Shah left the country. For the last decade of the Shah's rule, under the legendary management of Nasrallah Mornian, the office had been known for its exemplary efficiency. By the mid-1970s, much of its work was computerized. Every letter was stamped when it was received. Another stamp indicated the day and the hour the Shah read or was informed of its content. A separate box registered what the Shah had ordered. In more sensitive cases, the Shah read the reports himself, making comments or ensuing orders in the margin. Always brisk and brief, sometimes in a purple pencil, sometimes in red. Sometimes he even marked the file in which the document should be placed. In the days after the royal family's departure, General Neshat made a bonfire in the gardens of the palace and burnt all the documents. Rumors continued to persist that copies of all these documents exist somewhere outside Iran. The Islamic Republic was published so far some 600 volumes of documents from SAVAK and other governmental offices, but much of what they had published has been devoid of serious substance. Nearly nothing has been published, for example, about the Shah's fortune. Moreover, the published documents have clearly been handpicked to serve the ideological purpose of demonizing the Shah and his regime. General Nashat was executed by the Islamic Republic a few weeks after the Shah's departure and the burning of the documents. Before the Shah left Iran, the constitutionally mandated Regency Council was created ostensibly to manage the affairs of the state during the temporary absence. The first choice for the job had been Sagdahi, but he refused the offer, saying that since he had been opposed to the idea of the Shah leaving the country, he couldn't head a regency that would rule in his absence. The man eventually chose to head that council. Sayyid Jalal Tehrani seemed ill-fitted to the sensitive task. Tehrani was famously ill-tempered and self-centered, more of a scholar than a statesman. Shortly after arriving in Paris to meet with Ayatollah Khomeini, he announced that he was resigned from the council. His letter of resignation, or more accurately, his statement of recantation, was surprisingly redolent of Islamic jargon and Shiite piety. He wrote that, in light of public opinion and the view of His Eminence Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, may God extend his bounty, that he said council is illegal. He was resigning from his post. Tehrani was known as a man of much, albeit esoteric, erudition, a man fascinated by astrolabes and medieval astrologers. His support for the Shah had always been somewhat doubtful, and the fact that he was chosen for the critical job of heading the Regency Council is yet another example of the strangely inexplicable decisions made by the Shah during his last months in Iran. In his memoirs, Bakhtiar intimates that it was the Shah who suggested making Tehrani the head of the council. The reason was apparently his known close ties to the clergy, particularly to Ayatollah Khomeini. It has been rumored that Tehrani was blackmailed into tendering his resignation after Khomeini supporters showed him photos they had of him in a compromising situation. The Shah and his family stayed in Egypt briefly. The meeting with President Ford to discuss Camp David, promised by President Carter before the Shah left Iran, never took place. Sadat went out of his way to make the Shah feel not just safe, but royal. After a week, the royal family set out for Morocco, but it was only a few weeks before the Shah, much to his dismay and disbelief, was told he must leave the country. King Hassan was under pressure from Moroccan religious circles to get rid of him. Some in the Moroccan royal family had been opposed to the idea of allowing the Shah to visit from the beginning. Moreover, aside from the French intelligence agency's warning that the Moroccan monarch would face serious opposition from his domestic foes and critics, and the concern that the Shah's presence would overshadow the proceedings of an upcoming Islamic conference in Morocco, there was, in early February, the effort of the new Iranian regime to file extradition papers with the Moroccan government for the return of the Shah. This was the first legal step of Ayatollah Khomeini to demand the return of the Shah to Iran. even if there was no realistic chance or legal ground for ever convincing Morocco or other countries to send the Shah back to Iran. These pressures, along with the regular threats by Islamic regime radicals to send terrorist teams to kill him, made life more and more difficult for the royal couple. Khomeini obviously believed that the more the Shah was isolated and his pariah status underscored, the more royalists in Iran would be disheartened. He used the same argument when he ordered the trials and executions of members of the Ancien regime. Ayatollah Khomeini was known for holding grudges and for exacting revenge on those who had crossed him. He therefore spared no effort to pressure, embarrass, frighten, threaten, and isolate the Shah in exile. These efforts, some legal, some obviously illegal, continued until the Shah's last days. Few things underscored Khomeini's success and the Shah's pariah status as much as the fact that, until a few hours before the time he was ordered to leave Morocco, his next destination was not clear. No country was willing to provide the Shah even a visiting visa, let alone asylum. And then, shortly before his departure from Morocco, at the end of March, the government of the Bahamas agreed to give the Shah and his family a temporary tourist visa. While in the Bahamas, on May 6th, the Shah met with the U.S. ambassador who was carrying a message from President Carter. Earlier, the Shah had offered to delay his U.S. arrival to a time when it would not create inconveniences for the U.S. Moreover, he wanted to make sure that his children would be able to go to a school in America. Carter wanted the Shah to know that his understanding of the very difficult situation and the journey to the United States would create both for the United States and for the Shah was much appreciated, and that when conditions are more settled, they could return to the question of his journey to the United States. In Morocco, the Shah had been told that, should he settle in America, both his life and his fortune would be consumed by lawsuits. As for the children, Carter wanted the Shah to know that they would, of course, be welcomed to pursue their education, provided that in such a case, specific security arrangements for them could be made with private security services. In the Bahamas, the Shah received another piece of disappointing news. Since mid-February, he had been using Alan Hart, a British journalist, to sound out the British government about the possibility of settling in England, where he already owned a large estate. Hart had also been chosen to write a book about the Pahlavi dynasty. Through Hart, the Shah let it be known that settling in Britain would be his first choice. He promised not to bring a large security detail and to lead for a year or two a completely secluded life. He stipulated that there were no loyal military officers in Iran and with whom he could communicate. He guaranteed to abstain from all political activity. He indicated that he did not want to go to the United States. Not only did he not like the American way of life, but he thought that the United States bore an especially heavy responsibility for the downfall of the Pahlavi regime. Although the ruling Labour Party had rejected the Shah's request on grounds that giving him safe harbor might jeopardize UK's future relationship with Iran, Margaret Thatcher had promised that, if she were elected Prime Minister, she would certainly give the Shah asylum. When she did win the election in May, British intelligence, the foreign ministry, and other government offices immediately warned her against the wisdom of allowing the Shah into Great Britain. Not only would British interests be jeopardized, she was told, but British diplomats might be taken hostage if the Shah was given asylum in England. Commercial calculations or political caution cannot fully explain why big powers like the United States and Britain were so unwilling to cross the new regime, and why they were even willing to allow clerics in Tehran a de facto veto power over who received a visa to enter the United States or Britain. In May 1979, Sir Dennis Wright was sent to the Bahamas to give the Shah the bad news that he was not welcome in Britain. Wright was initially reluctant to accept the mission. He was by then on the board of Shell Oil. That's Shell Oil. And he did not, in his words, want his involvement to become public knowledge because of the wrath of the new regime and endanger Shell Oil Company interest. He did not, he said, want the trip to jeopardize my position. Moreover, he had long ago planned a fishing trip and agreed to go only if the timing could be arranged so as to not disrupt his plans. Eventually, on May the 20th, 1979, traveling under the assumed name of Edward and wearing dark glasses, Wright arrived in the Bahamas and met with the Shah. After some reminiscing about the past, the Shah, according to Wright, received the bad news with magnanimity. Moreover, the Shah indicated that he accepts but does not understand the British government's decision. At the same time, his pride forced him to insist that we had not asked for asylum. With Britain no longer willing to let him in, and with his visa for the Bahamas expiring, the Shah was once again in need of a country willing to give him a temporary abode. After much cajoling and pressure, particularly from the United States, Mexico finally agreed to issue him and his family a visa. Throughout the summer, pressure on Carter to allow the Shah into the United States continued. He grew so frustrated with the ceaseless flow of letters, messages, and implied and explicit threats, like Henry Kissinger's threat that he would withhold his support of an agreement with the Soviet Union unless Carter caved on the Shah, that finally one day he snapped and told his national security advisor, "Fuck the Shah," and asked him to go on to other issues. With every passing day, the Shah's health deteriorated. He lost 30 pounds, and he looked jaundiced and emaciated. Mexican physicians were, like almost everyone else, kept in the dark about the Shah's real illness. While the French doctors traveled from Paris and surreptitiously administered chemotherapy, the Mexican physicians began to treat him for malaria. None of the many physicians, French, Australian, American, Mexican, Panamanian, and Egyptian amongst them, who treated the Shah knew his entire story. From some, his diagnosis of cancer was hidden. Others were denied the information that, at the age of 87, his mother had been found to have the same type of cancer he had. Not only did his health and his chances of recovery suffer from his game of stealth and deception, but ultimately the Carter administration and the U.S. government paid a heavy price for it. Would the Islamic regime have been as paranoid about the Shah's travel to the United States if by the time of his travel to New York the story of his cancer had been an established fact? As it was, the worse his health became, the more pressure there was on Carter to let the Shah in. The president was assured that the only place the Shah could receive adequate care for his cancer was in the United States. On September 28, 1979, the State Department was informed by David Rockefeller's office that the Shah was ill in Mexico and that Rockefeller had sent his personal physician to examine him, and that, before long, this would be followed by a request that he had be admitted to the United States for health reasons and on humanitarian grounds. Agencies in the U.S. government, from the CIA to the State Department, began to think about the possible ramifications of such a move. The Iran desk at the State Department decided that the U.S. should make no move towards admitting the Shah until we have obtained and tested a new and substantially more effective guard force for the embassy in Iran. It is not clear to what extent Rockefeller's interest in the matter was based on his extensive financial dealings with the Shah and the royal family. He had been for years the Shah's private banker and the designated executor of his will. In 1978, his Chase Manhattan Bank had decided to give Iran a loan of $500 million, even though the Iranian attorneys the bank had retained to check into the legality of this transaction had advised against making the loan. After the revolution, the new Iranian regime began making substantial withdrawals from Iran's Chase Manhattan account. The combination of these facts gave rise to all kinds of conspiracy theories. According to one theory, the Rockefellers and their allies, like Kissinger, pressed for the Shah's entry into the United States, knowing that the act would precipitate violence in Iran and make a freeze of Iran's assets inevitable. Such a freeze would make a repayment of the dubious loan possible. The Chase theory became so prevalent in the press that in July 1981 the Senate Committee on Banking, Finance, and Urban Affairs prepared a report that directly and ineffectively attempted to deny the Chase Manhattan thesis. It remains a fact that Chase Manhattan was indeed near the top of the list of American banks who were able to turn a profit on the hostage crisis. Regardless of the motivation, there is also no doubt that what precipitated the crisis was the reluctant decision by the Carter administration to allow the Shah into the United States. A long litany of prominent Americans had by then also argued that the Shah must be allowed in, at least on humanitarian grounds. His health had deteriorated in Mexico, and he needed another operation, which his supporters argued could only be safely performed in the United States. But the Carter administration continued to resist these demands. Initially, the Shah had also been against the idea of going to the United States. When the Queen suggested such a trip, the Shah shouted at her and the other aide who had suggested the idea, "I am not wanted there, and I am not welcome. Forget it." The State Department conducted its own examination of the Shah by dispatching its medical director to visit him. He found the Shah to have enlarged neck glands, increasing abdominal distress, as well as being deeply jaundiced. There is no doubt that he has malignant lymphoma, which is escaping standard chemotherapy. He concluded that highly technical studies are needed to diagnose, grade, and analyze his lymphoma. These studies, he concluded, cannot be carried out by any of the medical facilities in Mexico. Years later, Dr. Benjamin Keene, a member of the Shah's medical team, disagreed with the assessment, an assessment, incidentally, central to the decision to allow the Shah into the United States, saying that he, Keene, knew the sophisticated equipment needed for the Shah's diagnosis and treatment could be found in Mexico. Whether the conclusion of the State Department's medical director was political or purely medical, the pressure on the Carter administration to allow the Shah into the United States was incessant. Senator Charles Percy of Illinois, for example, long known as an ally of the Pahlavi regime, wrote to Secretary of State Vance on October 2, 1979, asking why the United States can offer haven on quick notice to members of the Soviet Union's Bolshoi, taking into account all the implications of this, but could not work something out for the Shah. Indeed, as a result of this caution, the United States went out of its way to convince the new Islamic regime that there was no conspiracy involved in giving the Shah a visa. On October 21st, the U.S. Charge d'Affaires met with Mehdi Bazargan, the Prime Minister of the Islamic regime, and told him of the Shah's serious medical condition. If the Shah is sick, Bazargan asked, why does he not go to Europe? In a later meeting, Iranian officials demanded that their own physicians examine the Shah. The United States agreed, but the Shah would not permit regime physicians to examine him. To break the impasse, the State Department tried to arrange a meeting between the Shah's physicians and the Iranian medical team, but for reasons that are not clear, even that arrangement never worked out. The day after the meeting with the Prime Minister, U.S. Embassy staff in Tehran met again with Iranian officials, this time with Foreign Minister Ibrahim Yazdi, who reported the regime's demand that the Shah be visited by a group of Iranian physicians. Moreover, he wanted to make sure that the United States would abide by the agreement to not only prohibit the Shah from any political activity in the United States, but to extend the ban to the Queen as well. Yazdi said that the Iranian government now regarded her as currently more politically involved than the Shah, citing an interview with unspecified French periodical. Not long after the meeting in Tehran, in the evening of October 22, 1979, a private Gulfstream aircraft landed at LaGuardia Airport, carrying the Shah and the Queen and a small coterie of aides. Carter's decision to issue the Shah a visa had been a difficult one. In his own words, I was told the Shah was desperately ill at the point of death, and that New York was the only place where he could get the requisite medical attention. Moreover, Carter believed that Iranian officials had promised to protect American diplomats in the event that the Shah was allowed to visit the United States for medical reasons. The Shah arrived in New York and was taken directly to New York Hospital. The experience must have created in the Shah a riot of emotions. He was taken to the same room he had used in 1955 when in his salad days he had visited the hospital with Soraya. He had been worried about fertility then. Now, mortality was on his mind. Both times the hospital had to keep the visit private. This time the White House had tried to keep the Shah's arrival secret and prevent it from becoming a media circus. Robert Aramayo, who had been assigned by David Rockefeller to be the Shah's special assistant in exile, decided for security reasons not to register the Shah in the Shah's own name, but then, for reasons hard to fathom, he decided to use the name of David Newsom, Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs. Newsom was understandably not amused, particularly after the New York Times broke the story. The ramifications of this eventually forced the resignation of the hospital's vice president for public affairs, who believed the public had a right to know the entire medical story to justify the Shah's admission to the U.S. As the Shah was settling into the hospital room in New York, a group of young students held a meeting in a small house in one of Tehran's sprawling suburbs. They represented all the major universities in Tehran. 2 delegates from each institution had come to represent their universities, most zealous Islamic students. They were meeting to plan a response to the U.S. decision to allow the Shah into the United States, and they agreed to take over the American embassy in Tehran. Amongst those present in the first plenary meeting was a young man from a third-tier technical university called Ilm-o-Sanat, Science and Technology. His name was Mohammed Ahmadinejad. He participated only in the first plenary meeting and stopped attending after he realized they were not also going to take over the Soviet embassy. The rest of the students completed their plans, and to the shock of the Carter administration and the world, on November 4th, 1979, they climbed the walls of the American embassy and took diplomats and other staff hostage. 6 American diplomats who happened to be outside the embassy compound at the time took refuge in the Canadian embassy and were eventually whisked out of the country under assumed names in an operation masterminded by the CIA. Before long, Ayatollah Khomeini expressed his support for the occupation of the embassy, and so began the 444-day ordeal of the hostage crisis. The students' main demand was the return of the Shah. Aside from his own medical problems and his concern about the hostage crisis, the Shah's stay at the hospital was uncomfortable for a variety of other reasons. His therapy, for example, required that on more than one occasion he be taken from his room in New York Hospital to the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center across the street. For security reasons, the Shah, always in the dark of the early morning hours, was wheeled through the tunnel that connects the 2 buildings. He sat under a blanket, surrounded by a handful of hospital staff and security men, and was then carried through the chilly caverns beneath the New York streets, a scene reminiscent of Homer's Hades. Moreover, although he was given an exclusive suite of rooms on the 7th floor, he could still hear the shouts of demonstrators congregating in front of the hospital, some demanding his extradition, others his execution. He often watched the news, and there, too, he was more than once forced to hear criticism of his rule, of Savic's brutality, and of his family's corruption. He listened to Anthony Parsons. For the last years of his rule, the British ambassador to Iran, and now Britain's ambassador to the UN, lambasted him at a meeting of the UN. "Listen to that son of a bitch," the Shah said in a halting voice to Ardashir Zahidi, who was in the room at the time. Furthermore, he was sure his room was bugged. The most sensitive messages he would jot down on a yellow writing pad he kept by his bed. We cannot be sure if his fear was entirely justified, but we do know that, on the orders of President Carter, his phone was indeed bugged. On November 30th, it was decided that the Shah could leave the hospital. He had already declared that his preferred destination would be Mexico. where he had lived before, and where the president had invited him back. But on the morning of November 30, much to his consternation, he was informed that he was no longer welcome in Mexico. The ostensible reason given was that his presence is becoming a threat to their national interest. The Mexicans were worried about their diplomats being taken hostage, they said. Queen Farah offers a different reason, suggested that Fidel Castro had told the Mexican president that Cuba would vote for his country's entry into the Security Council of the United Nations on condition that he refused to give the Shah a refuge. Either way, the Shah was cornered. Robert Armao contracted the State Department and said His Imperial Majesty was officially throwing himself at the administration's mercy. Until then, the Shah had tried to avoid making any official request of the United States. He felt betrayed by them, and now he was out of options. As the Shah lay sick in bed, the Carter administration was of two minds about what to do with him. With every passing day, the hostage crisis took on more significance in Carter's re-election bid. Some in the administration favored pushing the Shah out of the United States as expeditiously as possible. Others, like Berezininsky, opposed the move, saying it would compromise America's national honor and amount to giving into a student mob. Initially, Carter sided with those opposed to pushing the Shah out. But on November 14th, he changed his mind again, this time appointing Vice President Walter Mondale as the point man on the effort to get the Shah out of the U.S. as soon as possible. When Lloyd Carter, Carter's emissary, went to see the Shah in the hospital to talk about his departure, we told him that there were only 3 countries willing to take him: South Africa, Paraguay, and Egypt. The United States was against the idea of the Shah's going to Egypt, as it might threaten Sadat's position. The Shah was adamantly against going to either of the other 2 countries. He was also told that while he was in the United States, he couldn't go to his twin sister's home in Beekman Place in Manhattan. A new stalemate had developed. The Shah was told he was leaving the hospital without knowing where he might seek asylum, or even where he might stay while his visa problems were resolved. Even something as simple as taking the Shah out of the hospital was a security nightmare. Anti-Shah demonstrators and the paparazzi were on a 24-hour vigil outside. On the night of the transfer, they moved the Shah through an underground tunnel to the Sloan Kettering Institute, to an unwatched exit onto First Avenue. From there, the Shah's entourage went to LaGuardia and boarded a U.S. Air Force DC jet, which flew them to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. From the plane, the royal couple was taken to the base hospital and given 2 rooms in the psychiatric ward. The Shah was put in a room with a walled-up window, and the Queen was taken to an adjoining room where there was no door handle on the inside but a microphone on the ceiling. Both rooms had all the trappings of a prison. Without saying a word, the Shah moved to the bed, pulled a sheet over his head, and lay down. He was exhausted, too tired to even object, but his wife was not. "Are we prisoners? Are they trying to hand us over to the mullahs?" she asked angrily. She even wondered whether the whole incredible setup was put in place just to drive us mad. Camp commanders reminded her that these were the safest rooms they could find, and they talked about the safety concerns of a place like Lackland where students could freely come and go, and promised to move them to better facilities as soon as possible. 3 hours later, the Shah and his wife were moved to a small three-room bungalow that was usually set aside for visiting officers. The Shah spent 2 weeks at the base. Once they put their unpleasant arrival behind them, the Shah cheered up, particularly when he could swap aviation experiences with some of the officers. But from the beginning, it was clear that Lackland was a temporary point of transit. The Shah still needed an asylum, and only 3 countries were willing to give it to him. While on the base, the Shah heard the news that his nephew, Prince Shahryar, had been assassinated in Paris on December 7th. He had been an officer in the Iranian Navy and was the only member of the royal family who had dedicated himself to continuing the fight against the clerical regime. The death put the Shah into a mood of silent despair. Princess Ashraf, Shahryar's mother, joined him at the base, only adding to his grief. Further increasing his anguish was the fact that while at Lackland, the Shah was informed that South Africa had withdrawn its offer of asylum. In retrospect, although a 2008 survey by the Times identified the Shah as one of the world's 10 most decadent dictators, along with such exiled figures as Mobutu, Idi Amin, and Ferdinand Marcos, and in spite of the fact that, even in the harshest assessment of his critics, his descendants and crimes paled in comparison to Mobutu or an Idi Amin. No other member of this cohort of infamy was treated with as such contempt and derision as the Shah. These others were all given safe asylums, where they lived and enjoyed the fruits of their decadent rule. The Shah, however, was subjected to every form of indignity and embarrassment imaginable at the time. Ayatollah Khomeini's role in this sad saga is explained by his penchant for revenge and his enmity toward the Shah. What is more difficult to fathom is the international chorus that accompanied his bloodlust. A dying man, unkinged and hounded by terrorists, was denied even the dignity of a quiet corner to die. The stalemate was finally broken on December 12th when Hamilton Jordan, Carter's chief of staff, flew to Texas and gave the Shah the good news that Panama had agreed to offer the Shah its hospitality. Though physicians had concluded that the Shah needed another operation, he decided to leave the United States as soon as possible and do the operation later in Panama. More than once, he told his American interlocutors that he would abide by any decision they made about the time of departure, and that he would do anything he could to expedite the release of the American hostages. He invariably added that he believed that no concessions would bring about a release of the hostages. The regime in Iran consisted, in his mind, of nothing but criminals and communists, and was not amenable to the normal logic of diplomacy. When the American ambassador tried to inform the Panamanians that their controversial guest was on his way, he eventually found General Omar Torrijos, the strongman who actually ran the country, drunk in bed in one of his dozens of houses. It was decided that the Shah would stay in the house of a successful businessman named Gabriel Louis Galindo, who had made his fortune providing banana boxes for the United Fruit Company, once one of the most notorious of the Rockefeller family companies. Now he was asked to rent his house on the island of Contadora to the Shah and his entourage. The island, located at the northern end of the Pearl Archipelago, was a vacation spot of the Panamanian rich. Long after the Shah's departure, the spot gained fame by housing the popular show Survivor for 3 seasons. In 1980, the survivors were the Shah and his shrinking entourage. In what can only be construed as a cruel joke by Torrijos, he had designated as the Shah's local host a professor of Marxist philosophy at Panama University, a poet, a playwright, a sergeant in General Torrijos' security guard. He was nicknamed Choo Choo, and he had been a friend to Graham Greene and had hosted him every time he came to the island. On the 15-minute helicopter ride that took the Shah from Panama City to Contadora, the Shah looked gaunt and glum. He imagined himself sharing the fate of Napoleon and said something about Elba to one of his aides. From the moment of their arrival in Panama, there was no chemistry between the shy, arrogant monarch and the exuberant, populist dictator. The general found the Shah the saddest man he had ever met, yet he understood the source of his melancholy. It must be hard, he said, to fall off the peacock throne onto Contadora. He called the Shah a chupon, an orange bereft of juice and the flesh. This is what happens to a man squeezed by the great nations, he said. After all the juice is gone, they throw him away. Even in Morocco, one of the members of the royal family who spent time with the Shah described him as truly bereft. There was nothing left there, he said. Yet in spite of his appearance and of the increasingly grim reports from Iran, at times the Shah regained his sense of grandeur. In talking with Aristides Roya, the president of Panama, he referred to himself as a descendant of Darius, and rejected any comparison with Napoleon, saying that when Napoleon arrived in St. Helena, he knew his empire was finished. Mine is intact. My dynasty will prevail. I won't go back, but my son will. Security for the island was easy to control. About 200 National Guards were assigned to protect the royal family. The Shah worried about an attack from the sea, and so gunmen were stationed on the beach and frogmen in the water. And even more drastically, sonar devices were planted on the seabed to detect either boats or divers. One problem on the island was unreliable phone service to the United States and other overseas countries. Shortly after the Shah's arrival, a U.S. Army communication system was put in place, allowing the Shah and the Empress to place calls to the U.S. and Europe. The other problem, of course, was the Shah's cancer and the quality of the medical treatment he was receiving. It had become clear that he needed another operation, this time to remove his spleen. Panamanian doctors insisted on doing the operation. The Shah was fearful about being assassinated on the operating table. In reality, the Shah had relegated the decision about who should the surgery to Dr. Keane. In reality, the Shah had relegated the decision about who should the surgery to Dr. Keane, who ultimately and strangely decided on Dr. Michael DeBakey, known mostly for his experience as a heart surgeon. And finally, there was the question of possible Panamanian complicity in a plan to hand over the Shah to the Islamic regime. At times, the Shah and the Queen even doubted the resolve of the Carter administration to stand up to the regime and Tehran, and thus feared that the United States might be tempted to exchange the Shah with the hostages. But according to Carter, the United States never seriously considered that option. At the same time, he confirms that his emissaries met in Paris with representatives of Sadiq Ghazadeh to discuss the release of the hostages. Even before arriving in Panama, rumors about the condition of the Shah's stay were swirled in the media. In a press conference with President Royo of Panama, reporters wanted to know whether there were any conditions for the Shah's visit, and specifically whether he had promised to invest large sums in the country. Would there be limits on his movements? Who would pay the cost of using the country's National Guard to protect the Shah? There were no preconditions, Royal announced, adding that the Shah would naturally cover the expense for his stay. The answer was only partially correct. The Shah paid for the food of the soldiers assigned to protect him. They ate at the hotel near the rented house where the Shah lived, and the monthly bill for the food came to $21,000. Moreover, according to the same reports, the Shah met with a number of businessmen not long after arriving in the country, but making investments was not a precondition for his stay in the country. Before long, there were rumors that the Shah had offered to buy the island of Contadora, where he was staying, for $425 million. President Roya denied knowing anything about the offer, adding that the island was worth a lot more. On January 15, 1980, the State Department received a message from the British Embassy in Tehran that included the text of an official extradition request from the Islamic Republic to the government of Panama. It was a letter from Iran's Foreign Minister Sadiq Ghazadeh. You worked this one out. It's spelled Gotbzadeh. And you know, some of these Iranian names, we should really work something out a bit clearer in the transliteration. You know, GOT followed by a B, it just doesn't work in the English. Anyway. It was a letter from Iran's foreign minister, Sadiq Ghazadeh, and was addressed to Panama's President Royo. The letter praised the long anti-imperialistic struggle of the people and government in Panama, and applauded the large contribution of Panama to the overthrow of the dictatorship of Somoza. It went on to declare that the Iranian regime did not doubt that despite the pressures exercised by American imperialism, the people and government of Panama will not tolerate any longer the presence on their soil of the deposed Shah of Iran, a tyrant and criminal. The letter also included that it called a warrant for the arrest of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, requesting the Shah's arrest and the seizure of all the documents and effects at his disposal. In what, in retrospect, seems like a well-orchestrated psychological war on the Shah, Iranian officials soon let the world know that an agreement had been made with Panama and that the Shah had already been put under arrest, would be held there for 60 days, and then brought back to Iran for trial. Another official declared that a contract with the famously efficient terrorist Carlos the Jackal had been put on the Shah's head. The Islamic regime had declared earlier that whoever assassinated the deposed Shah and members of his immediate family would be carrying out the order of the Islamic Revolutionary Council. This was only the first of many instances in which the regime put out contracts on the lives of its opponents or those whose art or writings it found distasteful. It has been estimated that the regime assassinated more than 200 of its opponents in Europe. A week after receiving the extradition letter, President Royal wrote a note to the Islamic Council of the Revolution outlining the requirements for an extradition demand and stating that in the meantime the Shah is under the care of Panama's secretary authorities. He ended his letter by noting that in considering the extradition request, Panama would make every effort to abide by international law and hoped that, in return, the government of Iran would follow Panama's example and release the hostages. The United States was rightly worried that this kind of statement by Panamanian officials would be construed in Iran as an indication that the extradition of the Shah was a serious possibility and would thus prolong negotiations for the release of American hostages. The U.S. ambassador in Panama was instructed to meet with Aristides Roya and ask him to retract his statement regarding the extradition of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The United States was put in something of a double bind. Clearly, the release of the hostages was predicated on the arrest and extradition of the Shah. But such a step was not only opposed by many powerful Americans, David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, and Richard Nixon amongst them, it also would have led to a serious distrust of America by its allies. On January 30th, 1980, a meeting in Secretary of State Vance's office brought together all the key decision makers to discuss the extradition request. It was resolved to send an official to Panama to meet with the Panamanian lawyer who had been a former law partner of President Royal to obtain as much information as possible about extradition laws in Panama. This official was then to travel to Contadora and meet with the Shah. It was made clear that this official's mandate was strictly fact-finding and nothing more. Clearly, cognizant of tensions already arising between the Shah and his Panamanian host, the official was directed at all costs to avoid appearing as though he was attempting to negotiate differences between the two sides. Rather, the Panamanians must perceive his visit sympathetically. The brewing tensions with Panama and the Shah's increasing mistrust of his unpredictable host finally broke into the open when, around March 20, the Shah received word from Kissinger that he should leave Panama immediately. At the same time, the Carter administration was making every effort to keep the Shah in Panama. It is not clear what their motive was in this effort. Hamilton Jordan and Lloyd Cutler were dispatched from the White House for precisely this reason. But their efforts failed. A private jet was chartered from a company suspected of having ties with the CIA. It was finally time for the Shah to accept Sadat's open invitation and return to Egypt. The flight from Panama to Egypt was not bereft of excitement. It left Panama on March 23, 1980. Halfway to their destination, the plane landed in the Azores Islands, ostensibly to refuel. When the stopover lasted almost 8 hours, the Shah and his entourage grew concerned that the Carter administration might have decided to exchange the Shah for the hostages after all. But after the painfully long delay, the charter flight was allowed to resume and took a tired, despondent Shah to his final destination. He arrived in Cairo on March 24th, 1980. As he landed and saw Sadat and the full military guard awaiting him at the airport, tears welled up in his eyes. On his way to the military hospital, he told Sadat, "I've done nothing for you, yet you are the only one to accept me with dignity." There were a variety of reasons for Sadat's bold decision to offer the Shah asylum in Egypt. Aside from his own obvious sterling humanity and compassion for the once powerful Shah, Sadat in those days was involved in the process of challenging and marginalizing the rising Islamic forces within Egypt. As the American embassy in Cairo observed, offering asylum to the Shah was part of Sadat's thinly veiled attacks on the Islamic right in Egypt. As news of the Shah's deteriorating health spread around the world, the torch the Shah and Soraya had carried for each other for more than 3 decades flared up again. Through secure channels, Soraya let the Shah know that she desired to meet him again. A few years after their acrimonious divorce, the two had discreetly reconnected. Many a time when the Shah traveled to Europe, he found a way to quietly slip away and meet with Soraya. Some have claimed that the meetings usually took place in Gstaad, an elegant Swiss ski resort. Moreover, in the course of 3 years, every time she was in financial need, the Shah was more than happy to help. In one instance, in the mid-1960s, she asked for and received $10 million. Now, she knew he was on his deathbed, and they both wanted one more chance to meet. At the same time, the Shah, by then, felt increasingly dependent and indebted to his third wife. The meeting with Soraya must, he said, be arranged in a way that would not hurt the Queen. Ardashir Zahidi was the conduit of the initial Soraya letter. President Sadat had to be brought in as his security forces were needed to ensure Soraya's discreet arrival in the department from Egypt. But the Shah and Soraya were truly star-crossed lovers, and before any last farewell meeting could be arranged, the Shah's health took a turn for the worse. The meeting had to be delayed to a later date, and that later date never came. A few lonely years later, Soraya died in Paris. Shortly after arriving in Egypt, a team of physicians, led by Dr. de Bakri, removed the Shah's spleen, a spleen that was full of nodules, indicating localization of cell lymphoma. In other words, the cancer had spread far and wide, and the Shah's end was not far away. After the operation, the Shah was moved to the Kuba Palace, where he recuperated with the rest of his family around him. He occasionally received visitors or worked with 2 American editors, Tom Weir and Christine Godek, on the final edition of his sadly deficient memoir, Answer to History. Tapes of these discussions show a bitter, angry Shah, willing to lay the blame for the revolution on anyone or anything but himself. He tells the editors that cutting my wings, cutting me to size, was surely the wrong-headed Western policy that eventually begot the revolution. He complains of how, during the crisis, Vance never contacted me directly. And when the confused editors asked why he needed direct contact from the U.S. officials about what was clearly a domestic problem, an angry Shah retorted, I was incredule to believe in alliance. In the midst of these engagements, the Shah was attending to his wealth. His was a complicated network of companies, foundations, accounts, and banks, land holdings on the Costa del Sol of Spain, and properties around the world. On May 28, 1979, less than 6 months after the Shah left Iran, his attorney, Jean Patre, informed him that, following his orders, they had withdrawn from the Union de Banques Suisse all the assets deposited under the name of the Foundation Lutetia and the established Daletze. After having cashed the bonds which could be cashed, we established the Liechtenstein, the foundations Neversa, Zarima, and Ruken. These foundations agreed to open each from accounts with, respectively, Union de Banques Suisse, Geneva Bank, Credit Suisse, Geneva Bank, Chase Manhattan Bank, Swiss, SA, and Banke Gutzwiller Kurs Bingener, SA. A few months later, on October 17, 1979, the Trust Company of Willemstad, New York, was set up under the laws of the Netherlands Antilles. It was set up to follow the Shah's orders and, in his absence, to take instructions from Empress Farah Diba. The assets of the foundation were to be distributed according to the Shah's dispositions by giving 20% to your wife, 20% to your elder son, 15% to your Farinaz, 15% to your daughter, Layla, 20% to your younger son, 8% to your daughter, Shanaz, and 2% to your granddaughter, Maynaz Zahidi. The heirs designate could only receive half of their share when they are 21, and they may dispose freely of the 50% remaining share only at the age of 30. What these percentages are worth is a matter of wild conjecture, ranging from $30 billion, according to the Islamic regime, to $120 million, according to some of the royal family's allies. Those most likely to know estimate the Shah's fortune to be close to $1 billion, including the sale of St. Moritz House, of which Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi eventually became an owner, and its exquisite antiques and rugs. Many controversies, including the sale of the Queen Mother's jewels and the lawsuits against Ahmad Ansari, a relative of the Queen who invested some $20 million of her and her oldest son's assets, and was sued by the two when he declared that those investments had lost their value, continued to cloud the issue of the distribution and actual size of his fortune. The question of the Shah's wealth lingered long after his death. In a petition filed in the New York Country Supreme Court, index number 2201379, lawyers for the Islamic Republic claimed that the Shah, as supreme authority in the country, held a special position of trust and that he failed in his fiduciary obligation. The question of the Shah's wealth lingered long after his death. In a petition filed in the New York Country Supreme Court, index number 22013-79, lawyers for the Islamic Republic claimed that the Shah, as supreme authority in the country, held a special position of trust, and that he failed in his fiduciary obligation to the citizens of Iran, abused his position of trust and confidence to enrich himself by diverting government funds and property to his own use, and accepting payments, bribes, interest, and business ventures. The Empress is alleged to have cooperated with the Shah in the furtherance of these acts. Based on these allegations, the Islamic regime sought a judgment for the court to put a freeze on all the assets of the royal couple and force them to pay compensatory damages in the total amount of $25 billion and punitive damages totaling $1,500 million, and for a judgment of $30 billion for conversion by the defendants of money and property in 1979. On September 14, 1981, the court dismissed all claims. A similar lawsuit was filed in the Supreme Court of New York against the Shah's twin sister, seeking equitable relief, damages of $3.1 billion and punitive damages in unspecified amount. The Iranian regime claimed that in 1978 alone more than $15 billion had left Iran, much of it winding up in Swiss bank accounts. This claim, too, was rejected by the court. After yet another operation, this time to attend to what physicians called his subdiaphragmatic infection, after a liter and a half of pus, and necrosed pancreas debris was drained from his body, and after yet another period of recuperation, the newfound hope for recovery, on the night of July 26, the Shah went into a coma. Heroic measures by physicians resuscitated him for one last brief visit with his family. At 9:45 on the morning of the July 27, 1980, 60-year-old Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, not long before the King of Kings, the light of the Aryans, passed away. The next day, Ardashir Zahidi and Aslan Ashfar worked with Egyptian authorities to map out the details of the funeral. A procession began at the Abdin Palace and ended at the Al-Rifa Mosque, where the Shah was buried, not far from where his father had been laid to rest over 3 decades earlier. In spite of his long illness, in spite of having occupied the throne for 37 years, and although he repeatedly claimed in exile that his son would return to power, the Shah left no political will. The Queen decided to draft such a will on his behalf. In her own words, as I was there and witnessed the king's deepest thoughts during his last days, I considered it my duty to put together what was claimed to be his last will. The alleged will ended with these words: I trust the young crown prince to Almighty God and to the great people of Iran. Some of the Shah's confidants, particularly Ardashir Zahidi, objected to the posthumous drafting of the will. Some of the Shah's confidants, particularly Ardashir Zahidi, objected to the posthumous drafting of the will. A few months after the death of the Shah, Stanley Escudero, an American official who had served in Tehran for a while, offered his analysis of what went wrong in Iran. Why, he asked, did the United States not see this coming? He urged that, rather simplistically stated, the Shah's system of rule depended upon a firm hand at the top, supported by a ruthless security mechanism, and the financial capacity to reduce dissatisfaction through development programs, outright subsidy, and co-option of those who might have otherwise opposed the regime. He goes on to say that years of repression, corruption, mismanagement, sycophancy, hollow promises, and just general inefficiency made for popular discontent. Moreover, in his view, many Iranians are cynical and distrustful of their government, and thus overlooked or doubted the many significant accomplishments of imperial rule. Rapid modernization and burgeoning educational opportunities also helped set the stage for the Pahlavi collapse. The American diplomat concluded that the reason the United States failed to see the storm was that, from the late 1960s, it had become the unspoken policy of the State Department and the embassy to curtail reports critical of the Shah. In other words, the Shah's desire for rapid modernization combined with his increased authoritarianism helped create the tragedy of his reign, a period of increasing, albeit unequal, prosperity, ending with the rule of demodernizing clerical regime. On a personal level, too, the Shah was, in the classical sense of the word, a tragic figure, a hare pretending to roar like a lion. At the end, he was both a victim and a figment of his own imagination, haunted by personal and historical demons and dreads, believing in his own anointed grandeur, yet ruling over a nation that simply refused to play the docile role he imagined for it. What Othello said of himself can well be said of the Shah. He had done the state some service, and he had loved Iran, not wisely, but too well. Perplexed in the extreme, he indeed threw a pearl away, richer than all his tribe.